أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف الخلق وسيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما واجعل علمنا حجة لنا لا علينا. اللهم أخرجنا من ظلمات الوهم إلى نور الفهم وأكرمنا بمعرفة العلم وزين أخلاقنا بالحلم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم أصلحنا واهدنا واهد بنا واجعلنا سببا لمن اهتدى. اللهم زين أخلاقنا بالحلم، اللهم زين أخلاقنا وجمل أخلاقنا بالتقوى. اللهم يا ربنا اهد قلوبنا إليك واستعملنا لنشر دينك واجعلنا من أنصار دينك ومن أنصار نبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم ارزقنا اقتفاء أثره واتباع سنته. اللهم حبب إلينا أخلاقه وحبب إلينا سنته واجمعنا في زمرته وتحت لوائه واسقنا من يده الشريفة شربة لا نظمأ بعدها أبدا، واجعل ذلك سبيلا لإصلاحنا وإصلاح حال أمتنا. اللهم ربنا إنا نسألك أن تفك الكرب عن أمة حبيبك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم فك الكرب عن كل مكروب من أمة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم أنت به عليم. اللهم يا ربنا انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في غزة وفلسطين، اللهم انصرهم نصرا عزيزا مؤزرا. اللهم فك الكرب عن إخواننا المستضعفين في باكستان. اللهم فك الكرب عن إخواننا المستضعفين في كشمير. اللهم فك الكرب عن إخواننا المستضعفين في السودان وفي لبنان وفي اليمن وفي سوريا وفي سائر البلاد والبقاع والأسقاع أنت بهم عليم يا رب العالمين. Oh Allah, we pray to you, we ask you to bless us with emotional intelligence. Bless us with prophetic character. Ya Allah, we ask you to inspire our hearts by the blessings of the sunnah of your Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Make us of the great supporters of our deen and of the supporters of his sunnah. Ya Allah, we ask you to gather us in your shade and in the company of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to make us of those who drink from his hawd and his fountain, and those who are near to him in their status in the akhirah. Ya Allah, we ask you to better us and better the condition of the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ya Allah, relieve our brothers and sisters in Kashmir from all difficulties. Ya Allah, we ask you to protect them from the threats of war and violence. Ya Allah, we ask you to free them from all the difficulties that loom over them. Ya Allah, we ask you to facilitate their affairs and to protect our Muslim brothers and sisters in all parts and pockets of this world from oppression and from wrongdoing. Ya Allah, give rise to justice and give demise to injustice. Give charge of our affairs to the best of us, not the worst of us, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Ya Allah, make the best of our actions the last of our actions, and the best of our days the last of our days, and the best of all days the day we meet you and you're pleased with us. Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Amma ba'd, jazakumullah khair for attending session 2. The title for today is examples of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's emotional intelligence. And for those who are recently added to the group, again, I just want to emphasize so that you're able to engage. I'm going to share some of my notes that were from last week and some of my notes from this week in that group. And if you have questions or anything else relating to this mini course, it'll be through that WhatsApp group, inshaAllah ta'ala. As I said before, this course is a 6-part series. And I chose to make it using the assistance of this book with the heart and mind, the moral and emotional intelligence of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's by Shaykh Mikael Ahmed Smith. It's a very well-written, beautiful book for an English audience. And we're going to be using it to guide us along the way. I'm not going to read every page or go over every section or every part because there's not enough time to do that. But I'm going to focus on the most important parts, and then whatever gaps there are, you can read on your own, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So the reason why I made it a mini-series is because I think it's important to try our best to be able to feel a sense of achievement. When it's something that it's a 50-part series, it's very difficult to continue to attend. A 6-part series, from now until Eid, it'll be done. And I'm hoping that with that concentration and focus, there will be more benefit for everyone, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that's for starters. The second thing, how many of you guys did not get a book yet? and want a book, want to purchase this book? How many of you did not get a book and want one? Raise your hand high. Raise your hand high. So we have on the brother side approximately 10, and on the sister side, raise your hand so Sister Nadia can count you. So we have some sisters on the sister side as well. So inshallah, we have already placed the order, or in the process of placing it, we'll probably get 30 more books, just in case to get as many of you guys with books as possible. The first session was going over what defines intelligence, what defines knowledge, what defines wisdom, and we also went over some of the intellectual dimensions of Islam. And we went over the concept of emotions, and we reflected a little bit on intelligence. And there's a lot of detail on this in the book. And in fact, he goes over this in the introduction, and he connects it to how the Prophet ﷺ is, by recognition of the scholars in our Islamic tradition, the most intelligent person that ever walked the earth. Because the way we define intelligence is different than the way it's perceived by many. Intelligence in our day and age is measured by the amount of information you can retain. But this is not a very effective way to measure intelligence, because someone may have a high intelligence quotient in this sense, but when it comes to their ability to influence others, their ability to channel their emotions, their ability to understand themselves and understand others, you'll find a great limitation there. So we believe that and in fact, this is why in the Quranic discourse, intelligence is not reduced to information. And we said this last week. The Quran describes who are the most humbly submissive to Allah Azza wa Jal. The Quran describes they are the scholars. إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاءِ. And if scholarship was defined as information, then there would be nothing further from the truth. Because there are many people who have tons of information, yet their information destroys them, makes them very arrogant, makes them very unreachable, and causes them to use that knowledge to abuse the parameters of Sharia. That happens all the time. So having a lot of information is not what defines intelligence. For us, the most intelligent person was the one who was able to transform humanity and leave a lasting impression on human beings for over 1,000 years. Not the person who made the atomic bomb. The person who made the atomic bomb may have been a very intelligent person, but his knowledge was not put to good use. It wasn't ilm nafi', it was ilm dar. It led to the destruction of people and the creation of all the destructive realities that we see today with superpowers and their armies. What defines intelligence? Not going to go into that again. But I want to ask you guys a question, see if anyone remembers anything that we went over last week. What defines wisdom? What is wisdom? I gave you guys a specific definition. You remember, sister? Okay. Okay, you're getting there. If you wrote this, applying it with adab and akhlaq, and so that you're applying knowledge in the correct way, the way it's supposed to be applied. Okay, you don't have the specific definition that I gave you guys though, right? Does anyone have the specific definition? You have it? Okay, you're very close. I'm going to repeat it just so you have it. Because the definition, I didn't make the definition. It's from our scholars, and it's a very beautiful definition. They say it is فِعْلُ مَا يَنْبَغِي عَلَى الْوَجْهِ الَّذِي يَنْبَغِي فِي الْوَقْتِ الَّذِي يَنْبَغِي. It is to do what ought to be done, the way it should be done, at the time it should be done. That's how, there's one of the definitions among the scholars about wisdom. It is to do what ought to be done. And how do I know what ought to be done? From knowledge. It's tawdhif al-ilm. As you guys, your definition, it's basically putting knowledge to work in the proper way by doing what ought to be done at the time it should be done, the way it should be done. So we said an example of complete lack of wisdom is someone invited to a wedding and asked to share a few words at the wedding. Remember this? I gave you guys this example last week. And in this person's few words, they decide to give a reflection on death. And he tells the audience, you know, death is so sudden. There are examples in our past of people who died on their own wedding night. Can you imagine someone saying that at a wedding? What would people say? Oh, is it true? Yes, it's true. Is it a good reminder? It is a good, just not at a good time. Not at a good, because the husband and wife are thinking of a long life together, and you're telling them they might step foot out of the hall and die, right? So not exactly the correct, or someone coming to a funeral, a tragic death, a sudden death, and trying to explain to the family of the deceased how sometimes dying could be the best thing for a person. You think, okay, well, you know, that's true. Maybe dying is a good thing. But when they're grieving and you come and tell them, hey, you know what, maybe the best thing that happened to your loved one is that he died today, right? It's not exactly the most sensitive thing to do, right? It's not exactly the most emotionally intelligent thing to do, right? And why is that? Because people, when they're grieving in that emotional state, instead of making them feel understood and making them feel welcomed and embraced and comforted, it's good for them to cry. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, if you see someone at a janazah and they're not crying and they're not grieving and they're not feeling the sadness at the moment, then you should try to make them cry. You should try to make, this is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Why? Because they need to get those emotions out and channeled in a healthy and a direct way. So anyway, a lot could be said about that. Page 25 to 50, I will not cover in this course. He shares a lot of theories, and he shares the works of Imam al-Muhasibi and Imam Ghazali, and it's a very philosophical 25 pages. I'm not going to go over those 25 pages. But I do want to mention one last thing about wisdom and about intelligence and how that relates to emotional intelligence. We learn that the preservation of mind is one of the greater objectives of Islamic law. And the reason why that is there's no way that a person could preserve their true interests without preserving their intellect. Their true interests, meaning that which is their true maslahah by Allah Azza wa Jal, that which achieves their betterment in this life and the next. There's no way they could do that. And that's why we, as an ummah, very first word, iqra, are taught to break away from any influences of ignorance. Because when there is ignorance, there will be a great deal of problems. Ignorance is at the core of a lot of heartache and hardship in people's lives. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ عَلَى السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَالْجِبَالِ فَأَبَيْنَ أَن يَحْمِلْنَهَا وَأَشْفَقْنَ مِنْهَا وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانِ إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. Allah Azza wa Jal says that this trust was presented to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, and they refused to carry it. And then this human being carried it. The trust of maintaining Allah's kingdom and this earth of His, subhanah. And then the human being carried this trust. And then in the very end of the verse, Allah says, indeed, the human being is ever oppressive and ever ignorant. Zaloom, jahul. They're expressions of emphasis in Arabic. And this shows us the link between dhulm and jahl. Wherever you see jahl, you will see dhulm. You see ignorance, you'll see oppression. Wherever you see oppression, you'll find it rooted in ignorance. And that's how we understand dhulm. And dhulm is not necessarily just oppressing other human beings. It's also oppressing your soul. There's no way I would commit a sin without there being a sense of ignorance inside me. How dare I use the eyes or the hands or the feet that Allah gave me to disobey Him, subhanah. So that ignorance could manifest in me not realizing a day of accountability that's around the corner, right? So dhulm and jahl, they go hand in hand. And that's why for us, knowledge is a path to Jannah. Ignorance is a path to desires, and desires will ultimately lead to hellfire. So ignorance denies me of my purpose. Knowledge gives me purpose. And for this reason, we are taught to combat ignorance. We're taught to combat ignorance. So the Quran says to the Prophet ﷺ, is the only phrase in the Quran that asks the Prophet to seek increase of something. وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا. Read the Quran cover to cover, you will not find the Prophet being told to ask Allah to increase him of anything but knowledge and awareness. Why? Because when I have knowledge and awareness, I will have the keys to realizing my status, Allah's status, the nature of my dealings with Allah, and the nature of my dealings with people. So you see, like for us, emotional intelligence, as we're going to learn about it, strongly relates to the spiritual path. When I am someone who's plagued with spiritual diseases, then I'm not emotionally intelligent. I can't be. That's how I understand emotional intelligence. Example, you have arrogance in your heart, right? There's no way a person would have an ounce of arrogance without them having ignorance in their heart. Because had they been fully aware, they would have realized there's nothing to them for them to be arrogant about. What am I going to be arrogant about? Everything I have, Allah gave me. With a glimpse of an eye, He could take it away. Arrogant about what? Right? When I say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin, all praises belonging to Allah Azza wa Jal, Lord of the worlds. What does that mean? Whenever someone praises me, it's actually a manifestation of Allah's ihsan, Allah's excellence. That's where it came from. And whenever someone else is praised, I'm not going to have envy towards them. Why? Because I see the goodness that appeared on their hands, a product of Allah's ihsan and His excellence. So when I start to realize that, I'll realize the path to emotional intelligence and emotional awareness is actually the spiritual path that I embrace as a Muslim to purify my heart. There's no way that I can have emotional intelligence and then show off to another human being. Why? Because had I known that what Allah has is far greater than what any other human being has, there's no way I'd seek another human being. There's no way I could be emotionally intelligent and think that what Zayd, Amr, or Fatima can do for me matches what Allah could do for me. So when I become a sincere believer, I become more emotionally intelligent. When I become a humble believer, a less envious believer, I become more emotionally intelligent. And you find the hallmark of ignorance. And I'll give you one last example from diseases of the heart. You have su'u dhann, one of the diseases. Su'u dhann. Bad assumptions. Hallmark of ignorance. You find this person plagued with insecurities. Oh, why did that person look at me like that? Why did he talk to me like that? Why didn't he treat me like that? All of these insecurities are a mark of a low and very deficient sense of emotional intelligence. By us, emotions and soul are hand in hand. Emotions and soul are hand in hand. That's why I told you guys last week, which demographic, according to the Quranic discourse, is the most emotionally unstable. I told you guys this last week. Which demographic? The munafiqeen. The Quran emphasizes in many verses how emotionally unstable hypocrites are. يحسبون كل صيحة عليهم يحلفون لكم لترضوا عنهم. They think every calamity will be their end, and they constantly take oath after oath, so that you're pleased with them and content with them, and that you believe them, and so on and so forth. All of these are signs of emotional ignorance. Now, a lot could be said about how Islam preserved the mind and what it means on the spiritual path to be intelligent, right? And this is the only thing I'll say relating to page 25 to 50. Aql, what defines it? What's the definition of aql? Why was the aql named that in Arabic? Aql refers to mind, by the way. Why was the aql named that in Arabic? Who knows? Yes? Yeah, it's referring to tying something, right? لِأَنَّهُ يَعْقِلُ صَاحِبَهُ عَنْ اقْتِرَافِ الرَّذَائِلِ. They say the mind was referred to as aql because it ties you down from engaging in lowly and debased behaviors. That's why those who disbelieve are described in the Quran as being like cattle. إِنْ هُمْ إِلَّا كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. Rather, they're more misguided. Why? Because cattle are fulfilling their divine purpose. But when the human being disbelieves in his creator and his maker, he's not fulfilling his purpose whatsoever. So he's worse than a cattle, right? So, but again, it's referred to, that's why this endeavor towards becoming self-aware brings me closer to Allah and makes me more emotionally intelligent. Both. That's why they say, مَنْ عَرَفَ نَفْسَهُ عَرَفَ رَبَّهُ. Whoever becomes acutely aware of his self will become aware of his creator. That's a quote. This is an important quote to remember. مَنْ عَرَفَ نَفْسَهُ عَرَفَ رَبَّهُ. Whoever becomes acutely aware of himself will become aware of his creator. What does that mean exactly? The Quran says it. وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُم. Don't be like those who forgot Allah, and hence He made them forget themselves. Right? So there's this link. What does this mean? Meaning that when I become aware of myself, I will become aware of all my vulnerabilities and the frailty of my existence and so on and so forth. And I'll realize how needy and dependent I am. And I will also realize how magnificent and omnipotent and great my Khaliq is. So when I know my status, I'll know my Khaliq's status, and then I'll properly surrender to Him, subhanah. So this is that dynamic of whoever knows himself will know his creator. So it's this intimate journey of me becoming self-aware. I become aware of my emotions, and I rectify my relationship with Allah Azza wa Jal, and by doing that, I become more capable of dealing with people. So again, very clearly, emotional intelligence, what's the definition of it in the Islamic discourse? That is becoming spiritually competent and spiritually aware. Becoming aware of this ruh that contains my emotions. And when I become aware of this ruh, I become in a better position to manage my emotions. Right? So anyway, when we look at the next section, there's a lot of beautiful things that he shares here. It starts on page 55. Starts on page 55 for those of you who have the book already. There are the words that he uses. One of them is emotional investment. If I am going to be emotionally intelligent, I need to emotionally invest in those I'm dealing with. And there's proof of this and examples of this from our Prophet ﷺ. He mentions emotional investment, 1. 2, he mentions emotional management or regulation. You want to use that word, that's fine. Right? How to manage my emotions. 3, he mentions emotional influence. Now, the whole idea is to get people to be guided, right? To be convinced. What guides people to Islam? Is it this? Or is it this? Is it something that is in the realm of information alone? Or is it addressing their conscience? Most people are guided to Islam not because of the information presented to them, but because of how that information penetrates. And how that information, I'll give you an example. Right now, they have this concept of kalimatu haqqin urida biha batil. A word of truth that is intended for falsehood. Or, the truth being abused by its carrier. The truth being abused by its carrier. Is it enough for someone to be guided, for them to be told the right things? The answer, I'm going to ask you that question, and then I'm going to give you the evidence. So, is it enough for someone to be guided, to be given the right answers? Answer: if that was enough, the Quran would not have told the Prophet ﷺ the following: وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَظًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. Right? فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ. is something he reflects on here. I'm going to share with you some passages and quotes. It is by Allah's mercy that you were lenient with them. Because had you been tough and hard-hearted, then they would have abandoned you. Imagine that. It's talking about the Prophet ﷺ, the most beautiful and the greatest of Allah's creation. If the information was not packaged in the right way, then they would have abandoned you, let alone you or I, right? They would have abandoned the Prophet ﷺ. So what does this tell us? The packaging, it plays a real important part in how the truth affects people. Because sometimes I might be saying the wrong thing, but because of, I might be saying the right thing, but because of the way I'm saying it, I may push someone further away from guidance, right? And that's why one of the companions, he says this, إِنَّ أَحَبَّ الْعِبَادِ إِلَى اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُحَبِّبُونَ اللَّهَ إِلَى خَلْقِهِ. The most beloved people to Allah are those who make people love Allah, right? Isn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His magnificence and His greatness enough to be loved? Why do you need to make people, but sometimes people can't see that. And they need someone to delicately and beautifully and responsibly bring them to seeing how great Allah is. Not because of any deficiency in His greatness, but because of the spiritual blindness that covers the heart, that needs delicate maneuvering to bring the person out of that spiritual darkness. That's what it is. So it's nothing about Allah. It's everything about me, as in my nafs. My nafs can blind me from truths. And that's why I need the Prophet ﷺ. One of the examples of emotional intelligence from the Prophet ﷺ's life is this companion who committed a major sin. And he got publicly intoxicated. And he was brought to the Prophet ﷺ. And he was punished in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. And one of the companions, as the man was being reprimanded for public intoxication, scolded him. He said, Allahumma al'anhu, oh Allah, damn him. Ma akthara ma yu'ta bihi ila Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam sakran. This person is always brought drunk to the Prophet. So then the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said to the man, لا تكونوا عونا للشيطان على أخيكم. Don't be the shaitan's aid against your brother. Don't be the. This is one of the narrations, the variations of the story. Don't be the shaitan's aid against your brother. Right? Sometimes, and in the books of Tazkiyah, they refer to someone who is a roadblock in the way of someone coming closer to Allah as قطاع الطرق عن الله عز وجل. The highway robbers. You know who the highway robbers are? Those who inhabit this space, like the masjid, and they're always here, they're the regulars. And then when some new face comes in, instead of reeling that person in, they push that person out. They give looks, they become very judgmental, they're very unwelcoming, instead of being of a very pleasant and welcoming nature, like the Prophet ﷺ was, always smiling. They are very, they're very dry, emotionally disconnected bunch. Our deen does not teach us to be like this whatsoever. No, I need to reel people in. That's what the Prophet ﷺ teaches us in this example. Now, again, what are the words that he uses? Two of the critical words that he uses is intrapersonal intelligence and interpersonal intelligence. Intrapersonal and interpersonal. And he says that when you have these two, you become someone who's emotionally aware. Now, these seem very complicated words, right? They're not very complicated. Intrapersonal, what does that mean? Intra, meaning inside, right? Intrapersonal, meaning I'm aware of who I am. Interpersonal, I'm aware of who's in front of me, right? I'm aware of who I am, and then I'm aware of who's in front of me. These are the two sides of intelligence that he's talking about in this section over here. And that's why, another example from the Prophet ﷺ, Prophet ﷺ taught us to be very mindful of what we share and who we share it with. There's a hadith that says, ما أنت بمحدث قوما حديثا لا تبلغوه عقولهم إلا كان لبعضهم فتنة. They look at the emotional intelligence, it has a wide spectrum. Part of this emotional intelligence is to know what to share, not just how to share it. what to share. ما أنت بمحدث قوما حديثا لا تبلغه عقولهم إلا كان لبعضهم فتنة. Hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, when you speak to a people with topics, subjects they can't comprehend, those subjects will be a source of fitna, and they will become a deterrent for those individuals from truth. That's what it is. And for that reason, one of the companions was in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ told him, everyone who says La ilaha illallah will enter Jannah. So the companion asked the Prophet ﷺ, أَفَلَا أُبَشِّرُ النَّاسِ? He said, should I go tell everybody this? This is great news. Should I tell everybody these words? That everyone who says La ilaha illallah will enter Jannah? The Prophet ﷺ said, no. Because if you tell them this, instead of making them better, you'll make them worse. إِذَنْ يَتَّكِلُوا. Right? So and again, this is where, and this is how even our scholars of the past used to teach a subject like fiqh, for example. Because fiqh, they used to teach it with, even the books, the early books on fiqh were like this. They would go over the inward fiqh and the outward fiqh. The inward fiqh is the fiqh of the hearts, right? How to become someone who is ihsan oriented. I am striving for Allah's pleasure. And the traditional fiqh that we know, fiqh, Islamic law, is the outward fiqh, right? And that is teaching you the basic parameters. Sometimes someone would learn information about fiqh, and instead of it making them better, it teaches them how to look for all the loopholes. Oh, well, I know if I do it like this, it'll be okay. And as long as I avoid that, there's not going to be any problem. For instead of this person's knowledge benefiting them, this knowledge ended up harming them, right? Because they don't have fiqh of the heart, which should guide fiqh of the body. Fiqh of the heart needs to guide fiqh of the body, right? So this is another example. And so why did this companion end up saying it? Why do we know this hadith? They say this companion shared this before he passed away from fear of being someone who concealed knowledge. So that's why he shared it. Otherwise, the Prophet, sometimes you share something with somebody, and why did the Prophet tell him this to begin with? Because he knew this companion could handle it. He had the level of intelligence to realize it's not about La ilaha illallah, it's a lifestyle. There's a lifestyle behind it. He's not going to misunderstand, right? So this is another example of the Prophet ﷺ's emotional intelligence. I want you to look at this. In the book on page 55, he says, this is the very first thing he says, he who mixes with people and is patient with them is better than the one who avoids the people and doesn't have patience with them. So he shares after this, human interaction is amazingly complex as we all play multiple roles in the lives of those around us. Absolutely. Easiest thing in the world is to run away from dealing with people. Hardest thing in the world is to try to learn from those dealings with people and make yourself and them become better. But that's what the Prophet ﷺ did. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was described as a Siraj al-Munir. The Prophet ﷺ had this intrinsic light to him. He had the most beautiful soul. That's what Siraj means. And he also had this reflective light to him. That's why he was Munir. Just like the moon, his light is reflected off of the sun. The Prophet ﷺ had the capacity to bring out the best of what was in the hearts of people. And that shows us emotional intelligence. So he shares an important example here. May Allah forgive us and better us and enable us. He says, young children without righteous caregivers as role models threaten the fabric of our collective moral codes. He says, fruitful and positive interaction is dependent upon emotional understanding. Why? Because if the parents are not emotionally aware and they don't understand emotionally, then what are they going to do? They're going to destroy their children. One time, the Prophet ﷺ was seen, he was seen hugging his grandkids, Al-Hasan and Al-Husayn. So there was this Bedouin Arab who saw this, and for him it was bizarre. Like, what are you doing? Like, why are you, these guys are boys. They're supposed to be men. Why are you hugging them? So he said, تُقَبِّلُونَ صِبْيَانَكُمْ, you kiss your children, you kiss your boys? He said to him, and he said to the Prophet, I have 10 boys, and I've never once kissed a single one of them, right? So then the Prophet ﷺ tells him, what can I do for you if Allah stripped mercy from your heart? Right? Again, subhanAllah. Prophet ﷺ teaching how important it is for parents to be emotionally intelligent. So if the father doesn't know how to articulate emotion, is this a strength or is it sometimes it's a perceived strength? Because you have a guy who is emotional, that's feminine. What do you mean emotional? Like, we don't talk about our emotion as guys. Like that's how it is in some cultures. We don't talk about our emotions as guys. That's for females to do, right? But if the man was aware of the Prophet ﷺ's disposition, he would realize it's not a feminine thing at all. The Prophet ﷺ regularly shared his emotion with the companions. And one time he was invited by he was asked to come by one of his daughters, who her son was dying. So then the Prophet ﷺ came and put this newborn or this young child's body in his arms, and it was taking its last breaths. This is a grandkid of the Prophet ﷺ. And he began to cry. And so one of the companions asked the Prophet, why are you crying? What's the origins of these tears? So then the Prophet ﷺ said, this is a mark of mercy. And those who have mercy from Allah's creation, Allah will have mercy with them. So it's a mark of mercy. So that's another example. And then he goes on, he says and this is on the top of page 56, in a well-known narration, the Prophet ﷺ taught us, all of you are shepherds tending to your flock, and all of you will be questioned regarding your treatment of that flock. Famous hadith, right? Famous hadith, right? Everyone know this hadith? How many of you know this hadith? I want you to look at the explanation that he gives for this hadith now. It's a nice explanation. So he says, all of you will be questioned regarding your treatment of that flock. Look what he says in reflection on this. One cannot expect to treat their flock well if they cannot understand them. What does it mean to apply this hadith? كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته وكيف أعين رعيتي إذا لم أفهمهم. That's what he's saying. How can I help my flock, my children, if I don't really understand them? So this hadith is calling us to invest emotionally in understanding those who are our dependents. He says emotional and social intelligence are essential elements of the aql, of the mind, because they teach us how to help, guide, and engage with everyone around us. They make us ideal shepherds. So healthy relationships require 1, a perceptive emotional understanding, and 2, large amount of emotional investment. Large amount of emotional investment. Now, it goes on. Look, there's another quote here where the Prophet ﷺ defines the relationships he depends on most. And then he describes his relationship with his blood relatives. Look, he says, indeed, the family of my father are not my protectors. Right? My blood relatives, they're not my protectors. He says, rather, my close protectors are only Allah and the righteous and believers. It's a hadith, it's in Bukhari. He says, they, my father's family, have a bond of kinship with me that I keep damp. سَأَبُلُّهَا بِبَلَالِهَا. He says, I will keep this relationship with them very damp. What does this mean? He explains it. The Prophet ﷺ is explaining to us that some effort has to be made to preserve kinship's inherent moisture, or else the bonds of kinship will dry up and break. So if I'm going to nurture relationships with my family, what does that mean? I need to be emotionally invested. And by the way, a lot of people, like if you go to the realities of broken family dynamics, people will begin to interpret their care for family in a material way, right? I'll give you an example. Son or daughter doesn't have good relationships with their mother, father, right? But they want to feel as though they're fulfilling the role. I'm going to keep it damp, like the hadith says. So what does it mean for me to? Some people, something you got to check off the list. Mother's Day is coming around the corner. I'm going to send a gift to my mother, right? I'm going to spend $100, $500, or whatever it is. I'm going to make my mother happy, right? With something material. But then when you look at the relation, and your mother will, if this is your reality, your mother will remind you of this. I don't want the $100 gift. I want you to respect me. I want you to love me. I want you to appreciate me. I don't want you to give me a gift, right? So it's not something you check off the list. If you're not emotionally invested, I'll switch the roles right now. If you're not emotionally invested, like this happens sometimes, may Allah protect us from these realities. Like sometimes a father might kill himself for a lifetime working so he could get his children in a good college and so he could get them married and set them up for life. He is effectively, what is he? Money bank. Father is money bank. Emotional support? No. This is very common. May Allah better the conditions of our families and forgive us and better us, Allahumma ameen, and not allow us to become like this. But this happens. Like, got used to working 60, 70 hours a week, and you just occasionally see my children, and when I see them, I'm too exhausted to give them any attention. So what happens when these children grow up? Father got them the nicest car, put them in the best colleges, and then instead of appreciating it, what do? They show a very rough and tough side to their father. They don't want their father, right? They take the money, but they show no reciprocation of emotion. The father's confused. I sacrificed my life for the kids. I did everything for them, right? But what they missed out on most is the most critical aspect that nurtures relationships. It's not the money. It is the emotional side of the dealings, right? If I as a father don't remain relevant to my son or daughter in terms of caring how they're dealing with the world and how their iman is growing in their hearts, then guess what? I could give them $1 million or 10 million. If I don't emotionally invest in the relationship, they will turn their back on me. They will take the money and they will show a merciless side. This is not, by the way, this is not to encourage, so there's two sides to this. If we want to go with the examples, we will last forever. So this is not to encourage the son or daughter who had to deal with a father that wasn't emotionally intelligent, that you should be that son or daughter who is merciless because your father didn't emotionally tend to your needs. No, don't do that. Your father made immense sacrifices and did whatever he could as he understood it. But this is to teach me, if I, as a father or a mother, to not be like this. Don't do this with your kids because it tends to have negative results. But then, son or daughter, your responsibility, now you want to be emotionally intelligent. So that's the father's emotional intelligence. What would you guys say, the children's emotional intelligence on this side, right? What would it be? What would be the children's emotional intelligence in this situation? I gave you guys a scenario. Understanding the sacrifices the father made, and then what else? Consideration, empathy. What else? Keeping that door open with the relationship. Sure. Yes. Being soft to them. And you're giving me example. Very good. Very good. You know what's... I'll give you another example of emotional ignorance, right? For me to continue to cast blame on others for the challenges that I'm going through in my own personal life. If I want to truly be emotionally intelligent, then what? The realities that I missed out on with my father, I will be the nurturer of them. I will be the one who is emotionally intelligent and fortify what wasn't there. Again, because be very careful, because it's another sign of emotional ignorance that I continue to do what Iblis did, right? فَبِمَا أَغْوَيْتَنِي. Right? Some children are like that. فَبِمَا أَغْوَيْتَنِي. 20, 30 years later, I am the way I am because of my parents, and they didn't do this, and they didn't say that, and they didn't. Is that someone who is justified in their outlook towards the world? No, they're not justified. It's a sign of emotional ignorance, right? So, did you want to ask something? Lack of accountability? understand this. Jazakallah khair. Some of it relates to that. I don't assume fault, but that's not the full thing. If I'm someone who's tit for tat, right? An eye for an eye, and what happens? The world goes, an eye for an eye, and the world goes blind, right? If I'm someone who, because people commit acts of aggression against me, I become vengeful, vindictive, hateful, does that mean I'm emotionally intelligent? They weren't emotionally intelligent, right? But what am I going to respond to with? This is where we learn from the character of our beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, I want to give you examples. Like there's an example. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was far from reactionary. They came to the Prophet and said, Ya Rasulullah, ud'u Allah ala al-mushrikeen. O Prophet of Allah, make dua against the mushrikeen. They deserve it, don't they? They antagonized the Prophet. They brutalized the companions. They said awful things about Allah. The Prophet ﷺ said to them in response, إِنِّي لَمْ أُبْعَثْ لَعَانًا وَإِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ دَاعِيًا وَرَحْمَةً. I wasn't sent as someone who incurs Allah's damnation and wrath against people. I was sent as someone who is a caller to Allah and a bringer of mercy. Right? That's who the Prophet ﷺ was. Emotional intelligence is supposed to elevate people, not keep them in this vicious, endless cycle. That, by the way, that's why emotional intelligence will help guide a person out of every single conflict, right? That's why, what does the Quran say for husband and wife? If they want to reconcile both of them, إِن يُرِيدَ إِصْلَاحًا يُوَفِّقِ اللَّهُ بَيْنَهُمَا. Whenever you're dealing with marital discord, if both sides, but he said, she said, they didn't do, I did, that, and you stand endlessly characterizing the problem, you'll never resolve it. Never. And emotional intelligence means I'm going to elevate beyond the problem, right? Because the Quran says, if there is a willingness on both sides to rectify and reconcile, then Allah will give tawfiq in that case. Why? Because, again, emotional intelligence is supposed to bring me up. Right? It's not supposed to keep me down in dealing with the details, the blinding details that come about in life. May Allah forgive it. Again, these are easily spoken about, much more difficult to live by. But these are things that we need to push ourselves towards. We need to push ourselves towards these realities. The Prophet ﷺ shows us remarkable emotional intelligence in many situations in life, and he calls us as an ummah to observe this in our dealings. So I'll give you more examples of the Prophet ﷺ's emotional intelligence. He actually says this on page 57. So he says, when Ghazali says there was no one more intelligent than the Prophet ﷺ, we should focus on his ability to understand his own emotions, intra-personal intelligence, and those of others, as well as his ability to positively influence the emotional state of everyone around him. Right? This is what this is interpersonal intelligence. Then he quotes Sayyidina al-Husayn ibn Ali, right? He said, I asked my father about the gatherings of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Look at this. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not stand or sit except with the remembrance of Allah. When he would go to a people, he would sit wherever there was space available, and he would order others to do the same. He would give every attendee his due portion of attention, to such an extent that every attendee would think that there was no one more noble in the sight of the Prophet ﷺ than himself. He says this narration shows that the Prophet ﷺ, that the companions noticed how consistently and thoroughly the Prophet ﷺ emotionally invested in those enjoying his company. You see, this is a beautiful thing to think about. The Prophet ﷺ, when he entered the room, he did not have expectations. He did not want to sit in the center of the majlis. He would sit wherever the seatings, even though everyone would want to honor the Prophet and bring him up and raise him up. But you know what? One of the signs of emotional ignorance is for me to be a person of expectations. That this person needs to do this for me, and that person needs to talk to me like this, and this person needs to treat me like that, and so on and so forth. The Prophet ﷺ was not a person of expectations. The Prophet ﷺ had this capacity to make everyone feel like they were important to him. And he shares a funny instance about this later on. He shares it, where is it? he shares, yes, he shares this later on page 67, on the bottom of page 67. He mentions the story of this companion named Amr ibn al-As, who had just returned from a mission that he was handpicked by the Prophet ﷺ to go out to. And after informing the Prophet ﷺ how he completed the mission, he wanted to ask the Prophet ﷺ a question, like, okay, the Prophet chose me, I must be special to the Prophet. And you know what? I want to hear him say that I'm special, right? So, Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As decided to ask the Prophet ﷺ a question. He said, "O Prophet of Allah, who do you love most?" Right? He wanted, because it's a hadith now, right? So he asked, who do you love most? If the Prophet says he loves Amr the most, then everyone until the end of time will remember the Prophet ﷺ said he loves Amr the most. So the Prophet ﷺ said, Aisha. So then he said, I mean, from the men, who do you love most? So the Prophet ﷺ said, her father. So then he said, then who? Who was her father? Abu Bakr, of course. He said, then who? He said, Umar. And then he said, then who? And they went back and forth until Amr stopped asking the question out of fear that he would find out his true level. What do you learn from this? The Prophet ﷺ had the capacity. First off, the Prophet was very honest, right? The Prophet ﷺ was genuine, pure, honest. The Prophet ﷺ was not someone who would give empty praises. Right? The Prophet wasn't, because empty praises, by the way, they create mistrust and insecurity, right? This person's exaggerating praise and this person's not being genuine and honest. So, I don't know if I could trust this person and what they're saying. Maybe it's all and that happens a lot. By the way, in Arabic we call this mujamala, tamalluq, right? This person speaking to me with a very sweet tongue, and it happens a lot. Culturally, you raise the person very high. And then as soon as they turn your back, say, that person's like this, and that person's like that, and I hate this person because of that, and so on and so forth, right? Again, this is two-faced, being two-faced, right? It's far removed from prophetic character. But anyway, what we learn from this, Amr thought he was special to the Prophet, and that's because the Prophet ﷺ made him feel special. Now, one of the most powerful things, and he shares this here, what do we learn from this? Okay, emotionally invested, okay, I get it. The Prophet ﷺ had this beautiful characteristic called empathy. Empathy. It's different than sympathy. Empathy is, I am putting my self in the shoes of the person that's experiencing some difficulty or some challenge. I am feeling what they feel. And I'm being pained by what they're pained. And there's a powerful verse that we recited in Salah for anyone who was able to understand. لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ. عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ. It is very difficult upon the Prophet ﷺ to see his ummah go through hardship. Right? That's how the Prophet was described in the Quran. And by the way, empathy is such a beautiful, beautiful characteristic. It's one of the most prophetic characteristics that one could adorn. It's one of the most captivating. This is actually why the Prophet ﷺ was able to influence an entire generation and the entire world after that, because they felt he cared. And and they didn't just feel he cared, because he actually cared. He did actually care. He didn't just make him feel that he actually cared. So one of the biggest keys to the Prophet's emotional intelligence is his care and empathy towards others. And this built a strong sense of trust and love. And this is how it was a tool for change. So here, the Prophet, and he says this on the next page, 59, the Prophet ﷺ's character was described in the in a hadith, where his wife, Sayyidah Aisha, was asked, how was the Prophet ﷺ's character? And she said his character was the Quran. Again, Shaykh Mikail reflects on this, and he says, if the prophets of Allah did not have the necessary knowledge and skills needed to successfully pass on the message to the next generation, the argument would be incomplete, because people could excuse themselves for not believing, right? So part of the Prophet ﷺ's character being the Quran meant that he ﷺ had this awareness of what makes guidance penetrate the hearts of people. Right? The ability to communicate it. It's not just having the Quran. And that's why, and we said this verse already, he goes on to mention, if you were harsh and hard-hearted, then people would flee from you. So this verse clearly placed the burden of keeping an audience upon the shoulder of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So I want to go over more examples. More examples from the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that highlight his emotional intelligence. Among this is the Prophet ﷺ not seeing himself, and again this highlights his empathy too, the Prophet ﷺ not seeing himself beyond the lowest one among them. Again, emotional intelligence. If I am someone who sees themselves as elite, I'm up, I'm high, right? Then guess what? Then I'm not going to be able to influence large brackets of, and by the way, this favoritism, it kills the emotional connection that one has with others. If someone's has double standards in their application, the Prophet ﷺ was beautifully described in a hadith. They described the Prophet ﷺ's character. That they said, لَقَدْ دَلَّنِي عَلَى هَذَا النَّبِيِّ أَنَّهُ لَا يَأْمُرُ بِخَيْرٍ إِلَّا كَانَ أَوَّلَ آخِذٍ بِهِ. One of them described the Prophet ﷺ. He said this, he would never call to a matter of virtue except that he was the first person to live by it. This is again code of conduct. If I'm going to be emotionally intelligent, then you know what? I cannot make myself above anyone else. I need to humble myself. What are examples of the Prophet humbling himself? Well, I shared one last week about the Prophet ﷺ asking about the cleaner of the masjid when she passed away. And the Prophet ﷺ was very upset. Why didn't you tell me that she passed away? أَفَلَا كُنْتُمْ آذَنْتُمُونِي بِهَا. Why didn't you tell me she passed away? I would have made time. This is an important person to me, right? So then the Prophet ﷺ didn't just stop with the words. He went to her grave and he prayed upon her and made dua for her. Shows the Prophet's emotional intelligence. Among the examples of this particular thing, the Prophet ﷺ humbling himself to the weakest elements of society. The Prophet ﷺ speaking to the brother of Sayyidina Anas ibn Malik, and when his bird died. Right? You guys know the story, right? It's a very famous story. You know it? You guys know the story? No? Don't know the story? Oh, this is common knowledge from the seerah. All right, so Sayyidina Anas ibn Malik had this, his brother had this bird, and the bird died. He was a little kid, he was a little boy. And this pet bird of his, when it died, it made him very emotional. He cried over it. So then the Prophet ﷺ saw him crying, and he went to him, and he said the following. He said, Ya Aba Umayr, ma fa'ala nughayr. And this young boy responded, so what happened to your nughayr, your little bird? So then he said to the Mata ya Rasulullah. He died, O Prophet of Allah. So then the Prophet ﷺ then comforted him emotionally for the death of his bird. And you might see, well, sometimes people look down on other people's emotions and they laugh at them, right? And they see it as a joke, right? May Allah not make us from them. Sometimes when you have children and you see how simple their outlook is on the world, like they get this 99-cent toy and it breaks and it shatters them and it makes them cry for hours. Something very prophetic is to have the capacity, and sometimes it's hard. It's hard for, just to be real, it's hard for parents to do that sometimes. Like I'm thinking about, paying the bills and the bigger challenges of life, and you're coming to waste my time with a 99-cent toy, leave me alone. Right? So it's hard sometimes. But again, this is what our Prophet ﷺ taught us. This is what wins over the hearts of people, when they feel like you actually care. But when you want to apply this on a large scale, this doesn't just apply to children. Like imagine you go to a masjid, and the only reason they would care about your feedback is if you're a big donor. Imagine that. Does that happen sometimes in Islamic? Yeah, it happens sometimes. Imagine if the only way you're able to get an audience with the big shots in the community is if you're one of the big donors that donates 25 or 50 or 100K. If one of those big donors texts, immediate response. Other person texts, gets lost, right? No, may Allah not make us like that. Again, this is human nature, by the way. Sometimes human nature, and by the way, the Prophet ﷺ was taught this. There's a situation where the Prophet ﷺ, and of course, it does not say the Prophet ﷺ would do this, but one time the Prophet ﷺ was giving da'wah. And the weaker elements of the companions came, like the impoverished ones, the likes of Bilal and Ammar and so on and so forth. They came to speak with the Prophet ﷺ as he was giving da'wah to the nobles of Mecca. So then they said to the Prophet ﷺ, "Utrud ha'ula la yajtari'un alayna." We don't want to listen to you until these lowly people are out of our sights. "Utrud ha'ula." We don't want to talk to you until they're gone. So then what did the Quran tell the Prophet ﷺ? وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ. Wallahi, it's something very prophetic for the Prophet ﷺ to give the attention to the weakest among the companions, just as he gave attention to the greatest of people. And it teaches us how to, like, if I'm that person who has the serious, like sometimes it's a culture thing, right? Like, when the adults are having a conversation, the children need to, you fill in the blank with the word that you like. But anyway, they need to be quiet. They need to be quiet, right? Because the adults are talking. If I train my children like this, then guess what? Don't expect them to show you a whole lot of love when they're 15, 16, 17, if you continue to treat them like that. You know, another example of the Prophet ﷺ's emotional intelligence. The Prophet ﷺ was sitting in a gathering, and this is a very common and famous example, but I'll mention it because maybe a lot of people don't know. So in the gathering, they had this jug of milk that was brought to them. And of course, in 2025, this is not appealing to the sensibilities of progressed people, so to say. So anyway, they had this jug of milk. The Prophet ﷺ drank from it a little bit, and the rest of the companions were waiting for their turn. Right? They didn't have the paper cups, so he was right next to him was a young boy. So now the Prophet ﷺ was in a situation: do I overlook this boy and his emotions and just go to the next person because he's insignificant and he doesn't matter? So no, the Prophet ﷺ said to the Prophet ﷺ, he said to the boy, "Ata'adhanu li an u'tiyahu al-ashyakh?" Do you give me permission to give this jug of milk to the older people first? So then he said, this is a smart boy. He was a smart boy. He says, لم أكن لأؤثر بفضلي منك أحدا يا رسول الله. He said, I will not allow anyone to drink after you ahead of me. I want to drink after you first, right? Again, progressed people won't understand this. They'll say, ew, what? Drinking from the same. But again, the point is, then the Prophet ﷺ gave him the jug of milk, and he drank from it, and then the rest of the companions drank after that. There's other examples. Now, you know the example of the Arabi, the Bedouin Arab who urinated in the mosque. It's a very famous. How many of you guys know this story? The Bedouin Arab who urinated in the mosque, right? What did the man say? They wanted to go crazy. Or the companions wanted to reprimand. How on earth, how could you possibly consider? But then the Prophet ﷺ said, leave him be. And some of the narrations, they say that the man after this said, Allahumma arhamni warham Muhammada wa la tarham ma'ana ahada. Oh Allah, have mercy on me and on Muhammad, and don't have mercy on anyone else. So then the Prophet ﷺ said to him, لَقَدْ ضَيَّقْتَ وَاسِعًا. Allah's mercy is vast. Don't limit it, right? But he was emotional, so he reacted like this. So you see, subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ teaches us how he was able to win people over through this example. And he gives us another example over here. That is, you guys know, he mentions this on page 69 as an example for empathy. Do you guys know the story of the companion who came to seek permission to fornicate? You guys know the story? If you know the story, how did the Prophet ﷺ address him? How did the Prophet ﷺ convince him it wasn't good? Yes? He asked him a series of questions to build like rapport with the man, and so the man could understand. So what did he say? On page 69, he says this. Once a young man came to the Prophet ﷺ and asked for permission to fornicate. A major sin, egregious thing, to go to the Prophet ﷺ's masjid as he's sitting with the companions and you're saying, give me permission? So the Prophet ﷺ worked to develop a fine-tune and fine-tune his moral compass by first developing his capacity to think empathetically, right? This is what he was teaching this companion. Why? Who are the people, which demographic doesn't have the capacity to have empathy at all? Zero empathy. Who are they? Who are they? Psychopaths. Who are the people who don't have any empathy? Psychopaths. They don't have the capacity to think about how their actions, and sociopaths, they don't have the capacity to think about how their actions affect other people, right? So anyway, he asked the young man if he had a mother or a sister, to which the young man replied that he did. The Prophet ﷺ thereafter encouraged him to feel the pain of someone else. Man, if only people would feel empathy. Like this, everyone, who should this apply to? Everyone who dares enter into a haram relationship, especially I'm talking to guys with girls, with sisters, think about this very carefully. That sister, that female is a sister, is a daughter. And if you knew the devastation that you cause when you initiate a haram relationship, you would never consider it. Because if you knew what it felt to have a daughter that someone else takes advantage of, you would never dare do this. Same thing with husbands. That should keep this in mind. Keep this in mind. I'm gonna be fair. I'm gonna balance things out, right? Think of this very carefully. Husband who decides to put their hands on their wife or destroy them emotionally. Think of this. If you had a daughter and 20 years down the line, some guy came along and he did that to your daughter, how would you feel? Be very careful how you treat the daughters of other people, because it would destroy you emotionally if you felt as powerless as that father who gave you his daughter feels now that you're wronging his daughter, right? Again, just think of that. Think of that. It's a lot. And again, now let's reverse the script. We have too many cases in our community. Again, all of these are signs of lack of empathy and lack of emotional intelligence. Divorce happens. And this could happen both ways. But I want to be fair because I said something to the husbands, now say something to the wives. Divorce happens. And emotions are really high. Too many cases like this. And the wife is hell-bent on retaliating against her husband, and they have kids with each other. And she knows that she could get away with it. Hire a really good lawyer, take him to court, and the court will side with her. And she has evidence and text messages. And she could make sure that this guy never sees his kids ever again. And there are too many people who do it. And I'll tell you, anyone who does this, denies a kid of their parent, is a despicable human being. Unless it's a very rare situation. Very rare situation where the only way to protect the kids is to do this. But again, that's not easily done. That's something that needs consultation of third parties. But again, it's a despicable behavior that shows lack of emotional intelligence. Because I could get away with it, I will retaliate and make sure that this human being never sees his children. May Allah protect us from those types of situations. So look, so he built this empathy in the man. And you know what the man said? After he built the empathy in this companion, you know what he said? Allahumma tahhir qalbah. وَحَصِّنْ فَرْجَهُ وَغْفِرْ ذَنْبَهُ. He put his hand on the companion's chest and he said, "Oh Allah, guard his chastity and protect his private parts and forgive his sin." And the companion said, and you know what? The companion said, "I never had the urge to ever consider it ever again." You know why? Because he understood full well. But there's a blessing for the dua of the Prophet, of course. But he also understood full well why he should never ever consider this, because of the destructive consequences of it. So you see, that's how the Prophet ﷺ taught emotional intelligence. If you go to page 63, Um, I want to share two things from the book, and I'll give you a few more examples. We're coming close to the time for salah. I think it's at 40. All right, so I'll share two more things. On page 62, he says, interpersonal understanding is the core of emotional intelligence. My father would often tell me, this is what Shaykh Mikael is saying, it's not what you say, son, it's what they hear. Right? Sometimes you might be saying something, but people are hearing something else. From the perspective of emotional intelligence, this statement is very accurate. The way we interpret words, body language, verbal inflections, and facial expressions is based on many different factors. So, what is he trying to say here? If I'm someone who's going to be emotionally intelligent, then I need to understand how people are going to receive me, how they're going to interpret my facial expressions. I'm going to be mindful of my mannerisms. I'm going to be mindful of my wordings of things. And I'm going to be mindful of circumstance and context, right? That's all what it means. That's why there's an example it's relevant to this from the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Prophet ﷺ was in the darkness of night, and he was standing with his wife Safiya bint Huyay, and two of the Ansar were passing by. And so the Prophet ﷺ noticed, the Ansar noticed the Prophet, and they began speeding away. So then he told them, "Ala rislikuma," hold it right there. I am the Prophet, and this is my wife Safiya. So they said to the Prophet ﷺ, "Will we ever doubt you, O Prophet of Allah? Will we ever doubt you, O Prophet of Allah?" So then the Prophet ﷺ said, "No, but I was afraid that the shaitan, or I disliked that the shaitan would cast something in your hearts, because the shaitan circulates from the son of Adam like blood does through the vein," right? So again, this is very powerful. What does it mean to be emotionally intelligent through this example? It means that I care about perception of others, right? If I'm someone who presents themselves as someone who's devout, and I'm walking out of a liquor store, is this appropriate? No. I'm going to a restaurant bar, is that appropriate? No. I'm sitting on a table where alcohol is served. No, I cannot do these things. Why? Because of the doubts that it creates in the hearts of people. Now we have this other perception in society. Well, you don't care about anybody, let people think whatever they think, and I'm just going to do whatever it is, and it doesn't matter. Is this emotional intelligence? La. This is emotional ignorance. This is very reactive. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm going to make the truth at the expense of others, and that's not what I'm saying. But it means that I'm mindful of people's perception, and that's something very prophetic, as we see in this example. He goes on to say this. Ghazali begins his Alchemy of Happiness, a book on spiritual reformation, with a chapter dedicated to the topic of ma'rifatun nafs. And this, again, that's why I told you, in our Islamic tradition, the path to emotional intelligence is what? The path to spiritual competence. I'm someone who's spiritually aware, right? So in this section on ma'rifat al-nafs, he says, in emotional intelligence training, self-knowledge is considered to be not only an essential means for understanding and influencing the emotional states of others, but also the only means by which a person can gain control of themselves. So, the hallmark of, emotional intelligence in this regard, and what he's saying here in this section on Ma'rifat al-Nafs, is a sense of self-control. If I'm someone who has no sense of self-control, there's no way I could be emotionally intelligent. And that's why if I'm someone who lets my desires run wild, and I never hold myself accountable, then guess what? Ignorance will reflect who I am all around. That's what it'll be. So, and then he goes on to mention something very beautiful. It's a very nice book. There's too much to mention from the content. He goes on to this long section of how desires reflect a lack of self-control, a lack of emotional intelligence. And just to give, again, I know we're close to the end of the time. I'm just going to take a few more minutes, and then inshallah, we'll stand for salah. Another example of the Prophet ﷺ's emotional intelligence is he teaches people self-accountability. There was this companion, his name was Abu Mas'ud al-Ansari. And he was disciplining a servant of his. And as he was disciplining him, he heard the voice of a loud voice from behind him that said, "I'lam Aba Mas'ud, lallahu aqdaru alayka minka alayh." Look at the powerful words. He tells this companion, Abu Mas'ud al-Ansari, "No, Abu Mas'ud, that Allah is more capable over you than you are over him, than you are over this servant of yours." So what does the Prophet ﷺ say, teach us here? Self-accountability. Be very careful. You have a lot of power. If you don't hold yourself accountable with that, then you will have to face devastating results. So then he said to the Prophet, "Huwa hurrun ya Rasulullah." I'm going to emancipate him and free him. So the Prophet ﷺ said to him, "Amma innaka law lam taf'al lafa'atka an-nar." Had you not done this, you would have been struck by the power, by the fire of hell. You would have been burned by the fire of hell, right? You would have been burned by the fire of hell. Emotional intelligence means that I am self-accountable. It also means, and self-accountable for what? My actions only? No, my words too. That's why the Prophet ﷺ, he was someone who was very careful with the words he shared. He would speak in a manner that whatever he said could be memorized, right? His akhlaq were described. Inshallah, will be done in a few minutes. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم متواصل الأحزان دائم الفكرة ليست له راحة طويل السكت لا يتكلم في غير حاجة. يفتتح الكلام ويختمه بسم الله تعالى ليس بالجافي ولا المهين. So he says here, or ولا المهين. So here he says, he describes the Prophet ﷺ in the following manner. Prophet ﷺ was always focused. He was in a reflective state. The Prophet ﷺ would never speak unnecessarily. He would have long bouts of silence. That's what the Prophet ﷺ was. And all of this reflects the Prophet's emotional intelligence. A sign of ignorance is talking a lot. People who are ignorant talk a whole lot. May Allah not make us from them. May Allah forgive us. May Allah forgive us. But people who are intelligent are very mindful in what they share, right? But why? Because they say this: "Man kathura kalamo, kathura saqatuh, wa man kathura saqatuh, kathurat khati'atuh, wa man kathurat khati'atuh, فالنار أولى به." Right? They say whoever talks a lot will fall a lot, and whoever falls a lot will inevitably sin a lot. And if you sin a lot, then the ultimate destination will be hellfire, right? And the last thing I'll share with you guys, and inshallah there's going to be a part 2 to this next time, because there's still so much more to share about the Prophet ﷺ, examples of the Prophet ﷺ's emotional intelligence, and I think it's the most important part of the book. And it's the last thing that they continue to describe in the Prophet ﷺ in a long hadith that describes his shama'il. كان يتغافل عما لا يشتهي ولا يؤيس منه راجيه ولا يخيب فيه. Right? He says they describe the Prophet ﷺ. He would overlook the things he doesn't like, and he would never make anyone feel despaired from him. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful character, the Prophet ﷺ. People had hope in him. And he said, قَدْ تَرَكَ نَفْسَهُ مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ الْمِرَاءُ وَالْإِكْثَارُ وَمَا لَا يَعْنِيهِ. And again, all of these are, again, like you could literally, this is what defines ignorance, right? All of these things that are going to be listed here. He removed 3 characteristics from himself. Arguing a lot. Again, a sign of a lack of emotional intelligence is someone, he said this, I need to respond with that. And the person will endlessly argue for hours and never concede. Why? Because they always have to prove they're right. And that's a person who's very weak emotionally. Someone who always feels the need to prove themselves is someone who's very weak. So he says, al-mira wal-ikthar. He wasn't excessive, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in his words. And he would never put himself in a position where he would be distracted with that which is of no concern to him, no benefit. And the rest of the hadith finishes by saying, كَانَ لَا يَذُمُّ أَحَدًا وَلَا يَعِيبُهُ وَلَا يَطْلُبُ عَوْرَتَهُ وَلَا يَتَكَلَّمُ إِلَّا فِي مَا رَجَى ثَوَابَهُ. He would never put anyone down. He would never pursue their flaws. And he would not seek to expose people. And he would only speak in that which is constructive. Again, beautiful hallmarks of emotional intelligence. And inshallah, next week we'll continue with more. And as I usually do, those who came for Salat al-Isha, I promise to make it up in Salah. The Salah will be shorter, bi'idhnillah. So we'll stop here. And those who asked, did you guys ask questions in the Slido? If you did, then I'm going to answer. If you didn't put a question in the Slido, still put one. From now until next week, I'm going to look through the Slido, and whatever I can answer from those questions, I will answer them inshallah ta'ala. The Slido link is in the group. So again, ask, and it'll make the class more fruitful inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullah khair. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. If we could just please fold the chair.